This is a reading from the prophet Micah, chapter 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? So there really isn't any particular moment or story that can account for why over the years I've kept this passage close to my heart. There is simply something about the perspective it conveys that moves me, that brings me clarity in moments of confusion, and that I feel reveals something to me of who God is that helps me feel that I know God better. I'm short. Okay, there we go. Better for a little person. In this passage, God, speaking through the prophet Micah, tells me that when it comes to pleasing God, there is nothing to prove. Of course, every relationship involves expectations, right? And there are expectations involved in our relationship with God, but God's expectation is not for me to sacrifice myself on the altar of sainthood. On the contrary, God asks me to be my sister's keeper and to let her be mine, to do my best to do justice, love kindness, and cultivate a perspective of humility. Now, we could spend a lifetime studying what it means to be just, or to be kind, or to be humble, and those aren't necessarily straightforward concepts. But I know justice, kindness, and humility by the fruit they bear in my life. When by much trial and error we get these virtues right, they bring us into a deeper communion with the people in our lives. Okay, so often in our Christian tradition, we talk about God as a parent. God the Father, less often, but I think no less legitimate, God the Mother. And this is, of course, just a way to approach something that is beyond our understanding. But as a metaphor, it's really stuck with us. Thinking of God as a parent can help us feel close to God, but it's not without its problems, because parents are ultimately only human. And sometimes parents hurt their children. If we have or had a dysfunctional parent, thinking of God as a father or mother might not be very comforting to us. And unfortunately, I think the metaphor sometimes gets turned around in our tradition, and we make God into the dysfunctional parent, someone who needs us, their children, to obey, to worship, to have no will of our own. Dysfunctional parent God requires our absolute attention, demands great sacrifice, and punishes us when we fall short. This passage from Micah, for me, tells a different story. This passage tells the story of a loving parent who needs us to do our best to be good to one another. Now, I was fortunate to have parents who tried their best to be like this. And every time I worried that the direction my life was taking wasn't exactly what they would want, and I would talk to them about it, both my mom and my dad would say something along the lines of, "Honey, don't worry about me. As long as you're doing some good in the world, and as long as you're happy, I'm happy." To me, I think this passage is God telling us, "Honey, don't worry about me. Be good to one another. Take care of each other. You have your work cut out for you."
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lenny, and my wife Kara and I are relatively new to the First and Summerfield community. But in recent weeks, you might have noticed us chasing after our 1-year-old daughter, who's committed to explore every inch of the sanctuary. Instead of sharing today about a specific passage, I chose to share about a spiritual practice. And one spiritual practice that has been important in my faith journey is the spiritual practice of study, an ancient practice that spans multiple faith traditions. And my practice of study took on a new depth 4 years ago and ultimately led to a real upending of my faith. In June of 2014, my wife and I went on a biblical studies tour in Israel and Palestine. And prior to the trip, I thought I had a pretty decent grasp of the Bible, but I was up for a very rude awakening. Our time in Israel consisted of hiking on foot to storied locations of the Bible, where we would explore the site, learn about its historical context, including its culture, its geography, the archaeology, and then read and discussed at those sites the relevant scripture. All of this study was done communally, led by a rabbi whom we deeply respected and who is steeped in decades of learning. For me, it was the first time that I was really exposed to this type of rich context surrounding these ancient stories. Because of that trip, my practice of study shifted. I now sought to understand how the original audience of a particular text would have read it and heard it, and in turn, what they would have understood it to mean. And in last week's message, Pastor Vicky provided a great example of the importance of context, where the context surrounding just one word, Messiah, and how Peter and the disciples understood that to mean versus what we think of it today can better inform and even revolutionize the meaning of the passage. And more foundationally, I began to realize that the very lens by which I read and interpreted the Bible, and by extension how I applied it to my life and faith, was a big part of the issue. Because the filter that I bring to spiritual texts is that of a 21st century, Western, straight white male who largely grew up in the American evangelical church. And by contrast, the various authors and audiences of the biblical texts had a very different intersection of identities, being largely ancient Middle Eastern persons of color who were part of a Jewish minority, often living under oppressive empires, whether that be Egypt or Babylon or Rome. In short, the original biblical writers and audiences were by and large everything that I wasn't, and my filter was flawed. As this new understanding about the Bible occurred, two conflicting sentiments also began to emerge. On the one hand, I had all these positive feelings. My eyes were opening to new mysteries of the faith, and these ancient biblical texts were so much richer and deeper and more profound than I ever understood them to be. And my soul felt alive, and I felt connected to the divine. On the other hand, there's always another hand, right? Negative feelings were simultaneously rising to the surface. I was ashamed that I knew so little about the sacred texts and people of my faith that I practiced my whole life. I also felt duped and angry about being taught some things that were ill-informed, incomplete, or altogether inaccurate. And I had taught some of those things as well. Back home in the States, these negative feelings evolved into a real sense of spiritual disorientation. I began to wonder if some of my bedrock beliefs about the Bible were no longer true, then what else in my belief system wasn't true? And thus began a multi-year season of spiritual deconstruction where I've had to re-examine and question many of my core beliefs about God, my faith, and its doctrines and teachings. And for me, the list of questions remains long, even to this day. In my search and struggle for answers, I've had to let go of some old beliefs, adopt some new ones, and very begrudgingly embrace many unknowns. However, the pursuit of understanding and connection to the divine through the spiritual practice of study has resulted in more learning and more growth, both in my faith and as a person, than I've ever experienced in the past. And it's resulted in a set of emerging beliefs that feels more authentic, more honest, and more true to who I am and who I've experienced God to be. Things are still unfolding. I'm still on the journey. I'm still asking questions. But what I'm learning is that it's the process and the journey and the questioning, aided through the spiritual practice of study, and that's where the growth happens. And as long as I continue to grow, I'm on the right track. Thanks for listening.
My name is Nancy, and when Pastor Vicky asked me to do a testimony based on a biblical passage, I panicked. I was raised in the 60s and 70s in Catholic Church. I was 14 when I was allowed to go up on the altar and actually read from the Bible. It was not a practice that was done until then, until after Vatican II. Anyway, so I took the second option of faith practice instead of biblical piece. And my faith practice really is around two things: singing and volunteering. And as soon as I started to think about my faith practice, I thought of singing as poetry in motion. I've always liked to sing. I like hearing people sing. And volunteering, I've always felt like volunteer work was the fun work. As soon as you get paid for something, it's not quite as much fun anymore. But, so I've done volunteer work since I was 12 or 13. It was a prominent thing in high school. We had discussions about it every June. They would have an assembly on what volunteer sites were available for you to do. I actually got credit in high school in my senior year for doing Christian work in the community, and then we would all get back together and talk about what it was. I mean, this was pretty revolutionary in '74 in the Catholic Church. So it's always been something very much a part of me. I did, when thinking about this testimony, I've never done a testimony of anything before, so bear with me. The first song that came into my head was "Here I Am, Lord." And, is it I, Lord? I've always wanted to sing, when I sing that, to say, "Is it me, Lord?" But it really is a question of, really, Lord, you're talking to me? And it's been prominent in my faith practice. I volunteered all my 20s in different capacities and different organizations, and I've always liked to sing. I actually got college credit. I joined a gospel choir, was offered, and I got 3 credits for college. So fast forward out of my college years into 1994. I was about 38 years old. Some of you know I've raised 4 children. My 2 youngest I adopted, and this was before my girls came, Lydia and Lanchelle. I knew I wanted to adopt. I had gone through the classes. You have to go through 10 weeks of training, and I was waiting to be matched with the children that I really felt God wanted me to parent. So I was basically nesting. I did all the repairs on my house. I cleaned my whole house. I did yard work. I child-proofed my home. I made sure that all the books that I wanted my kids to read, that I wanted to read to them, were in the home, and I was ready. Except for one thing. I was driving a hatchback Subaru, and I knew that when my children came, I wanted to do camping. I wanted to get a dog. I wanted to pile their friends into the car and take them to soccer. And so a Subaru hatchback was not going to make it. So I went out and bought a large high step to get into it, bright red, Mercury Villager minivan. And I drove this thing, and I hated it. I felt so conspicuous, I felt bourgeois, I felt decadent, and I'm driving around in this empty Mercury Villager, waiting for my kids. And I was nervous about being a single mom. I was nervous about driving this car. Swore I was gonna hit something and be injured and not be able to adopt. So I thought, okay, take it easy, Davis, you're gonna make it through this. Why don't you see if there's some place you can go and volunteer, do some work, and get your mind off of this? I did volunteer through church, but I looked for something else. Enter Elsie Cofield, if some of you remember her. And AIDS Project New Haven had an office here. And through them, I knew that they had volunteer opportunities. So I called, I made an appointment, and I was going to go and sit down with Elsie and hear about what I could volunteer. Now, those of you who know me, I'm a little controlling and a little rigid in a lot of things, but I'm also a retired special ed teacher. So I knew I could volunteer 2 nights a week, Tuesday and Thursday. I'd be able to read to kids. I could go into the home and take care of the kids and give the parents a little break, or I could take the parents out to shop, or, whatever the family that was affected by AIDS needed that I could do on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and this would fit my life. So I drove over to Elsie's office. At that time, we met in the back room at, I think it was Emmanuel Baptist Church on, over by the hospital. Chapel, yeah. I think, yeah. And it was in the back, and I parked out front, and I went in and I spoke with her in her office. There were no windows. It was, a little dark, but it was Elsie. She brought light wherever she was. So I told Elsie my ideas about how I could volunteer, and she was just so happy that there was someone who wanted to do some work with AIDS Project New Haven. So I explained to her what I could do, and she was like, well, whatever you want to do. Well, we can use it, whatever you want. And I was like, well, what do you really need? What can I do really, Elsie? And she kind of hemmed and hawed, and she kind of looked at me and said, well, I know you're from Wallingford, so it's a ways. But what we really need is someone with a van. A large van that knows New Haven. I lived here 10 years in New Haven. Who could drive on, I don't remember if it was Tuesday or Thursday, but one of the 2 days that I could, who could come in, pick up people who had AIDS at different stages, and drive them, pick them up from their homes, drive them to a potluck supper at Emmanuel Baptist, and then afterwards there would be a support group meeting for them, and to stay around and then get everybody and drive them back to their home. And she said, I know that's just, you're in Wallingford, and it's a lot, but that's, that would be a miracle. And all I can think of now, I don't know if I thought of it then, but again, here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? Really? And I thought, okay, I'll do that. And for 12 months, I came in, and usually 2 hours before the potluck supper, and I would go around anywhere from 3 to 5 homes in New Haven and pick up people and bring them to the potluck, and then I would stay in the parking lot for usually 2 hours, 2.5 hours, and then I would pick them up and drive them back home, and then I would go home. It was 12 months of just absolute love from God. The people that I drove were wonderful. They were gracious. They were funny. They were valuable souls. They struggled with life, but they brought to me an understanding that life was a good thing, and that doing things with other people, just driving in the car, getting lost, trying to find their place, or trying to pick it. They were never, I could be a half an hour late. They didn't care. And I lost some of my passengers during that year to AIDS, and they were replaced by others. There was always, never a shortage of people who needed to go and needed support. And I was just so grateful that I had my big red van while I waited. And it took a year and a half before I had my girls placed with me. But for a year of that time, it was wonderful. And I really knew that that song, Here I Am, Lord. You know, is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. I mean, that's poetry. That's, you know, I will go, Lord. If you lead me, I will hold your people in my heart. Amen.